I thought buying into a nice, quiet community meant peace. Instead, it put a target on my back. One tiny change to my own property, something harmless, personal, and well within my rights, turned my HOA into a full-blown witch hunt. Overnight, I went from neighbor to problem. Letters on my door, fines stacking up, veiled threats about liens and further action. And the worst part? My neighbors just watched, afraid to speak up. What happens when the people who are supposed to protect your community decide you're the enemy? When I first moved into the neighborhood, it felt like the kind of place you see in real estate brochures and cheesy family commercials. Perfectly trimmed lawns, kids on scooters, dogs being walked at sunset, neighbors waving as they pulled into their driveways. The kind of fake perfect that almost made you suspicious, until you realized everyone really did care about how the place looked and how people treated each other. My house wasn't anything fancy, but it was mine. A small 2-story on a quiet cul-de-sac with a maple tree out front and just enough yard to justify owning a lawnmower. On weekends, I'd be outside edging the grass, fixing things, grilling, just living. I worked a regular job, paid my dues, kept to myself, but wasn't rude. I was exactly the kind of resident any HOA claims they want. The HOA at first was just background noise. A logo on the welcome packet, a line item in my monthly budget, a few generic emails about community updates and trash days. I didn't think much about it. If anything, I was a little grateful. The streets looked clean, people followed basic rules, and there wasn't a broken-down car sitting on blocks in anyone's driveway. It felt like order, predictable, safe. There were signs, though, that it wasn't just order. Little things that didn't click until later. The monthly newsletter always had a section about maintaining neighborhood standards, and it seemed to grow a little longer every time. At first, it was reminders about mowing your lawn and bringing in trash cans. Then it became notes about acceptable paint colors, appropriate exterior decorations, consistent seasonal displays. The language was always wrapped in phrases like uniformity and property value protection. I remember reading one line that stuck with me, even though I didn't know why at the time. We must all do our part to preserve a unified aesthetic. It sounded harmless, maybe a little intense, but harmless. There were certain people who took that language more seriously than others. You could tell by the way they walked the neighborhood, clipboards in hand, eyes scanning roofs and porches like they were inspecting a crime scene. They weren't officially police, but in their minds, they might as well have been. They noticed everything. A hose left out, a faded wreath, a basketball hoop near the sidewalk. Still, none of that touched me directly. I kept my place clean. My car fit in the garage. My grass was green. I paid on time. I was invisible. And in a community like that, being invisible is usually a good thing. The first time I really felt the HOA's presence was small. A polite email reminding everyone about guidelines for front-facing decorations and non-approved items that might disrupt visual harmony. At the time, I skimmed it, shrugged, and deleted it. I didn't have any giant inflatables or neon signs on my lawn. It didn't apply to me, or so I thought. Life rolled on. Work, home, grocery runs, weekend projects. I'd see the board members at community events, smiling, shaking hands, telling people how proud they were of how consistent everything looked. They used that word a lot, consistent. Consistent fences, consistent lights, consistent facades. And people nodded along because it sounded professional, responsible, adult. What I didn't realize was how fragile that consistency was to them. How one small thing, one tiny personal choice on my own property, could suddenly be treated like a threat. Looking back, there was a feeling in the air I couldn't name at the time. A tension just under the surface. Neighbors who used to wave started glancing over their shoulders after talking to certain board members. People would mention getting a warning notice and then quickly change the subject. You could sense it. Everyone was warm and friendly, but also a little careful, like they were always aware somebody was watching. And then came the day I made that tiny change, something meaningful to me, something that hurt no one, damaged nothing, and sat quietly on my own property. That was the moment I stopped being invisible. The HOA had built a community where everything looked perfect on the outside. But what happens when perfection is just control with better branding, and you accidentally step 1 inch outside their invisible line? It started with something so small I didn't even think twice about it. One quiet Sunday afternoon, after a long stretch of feeling like my house was just 4 walls and a roof, I decided to make it feel like home. I mounted a small piece of religious decor next to my front door. It wasn't flashy, oversized, or loud. It was about the size of my hand, simple, meaningful only to me. A quiet symbol of my faith and a reminder of why I worked so hard to have a place of my own. To anyone walking by, it was just a small decoration on a door frame. For a few days, life went on like normal. I went to work, came home, did yard work, nodded at the same neighbors, walking the same dogs. Nothing felt different. If anything, I felt a little more grounded every time I came home and saw that symbol by my door. It made the house feel less like a generic unit in a planned community and more like it actually belonged to me. Then, one afternoon, I found the envelope. It was taped directly to my front door, just below the new decor, as if they wanted to make sure I connected the two. The HOA logo stared back at me from the corner of the paper like a stamp of authority. Inside was a formal notice of violation, complete with a photo of my front door and a description of the problem. According to the letter, my small religious decor was an unapproved exterior modification and a violation of community uniformity standards. The notice warned me that I had a limited number of days to remove it or face escalating fines. My first reaction was confusion, then anger, then disbelief. I walked around the neighborhood that same day, really looking this time. I saw decorative initials hanging from doors, seasonal wreaths nobody had bothered to take down, wind chimes, solar lights, little flags in front yards, garden statues. None of those things had been scrubbed from the community. None of those people had violation notices taped to their doors. So why mine? At first I tried to assume good faith. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe some overzealous board member misread a rule. I sat down at my desk that night and pulled out the massive stack of governing documents I'd been given when I moved in, the CC&Rs, the bylaws, the architectural guidelines. I hadn't looked at them since signing. Now I flipped through page after page, scanning for anything about door decorations, symbols, or religious items. What I found was vague at best. There were sections about architectural consistency and unapproved exterior alterations, but mostly they focused on big changes, paint colors, fences, additions, structural modifications. There was a short paragraph about exterior decor visible from common areas, needing to maintain a cohesive aesthetic, but no specific ban on what I had. Nothing about religious symbols, nothing that matched the strict tone of the violation notice. The next day, I responded. I kept it calm. I pointed out that my decor was small, non-damaging, and no more visually disruptive than any of the other decorations around the neighborhood. I referenced the actual sections of the governing documents and explained why I believed I was within my rights. I expected a conversation, maybe a compromise. At the very least, some acknowledgement that this wasn't as clear-cut as they made it sound. Instead, the next notice was colder. The HOA doubled down. They claimed full discretion over what was considered uniform and appropriate. They framed my decor as a threat to visual harmony and community standards. The letter stated that if I did not remove it by a specific date, I would incur a daily fine. They also mentioned the possibility of a lien if unpaid fines accumulated. The message was clear. This was not a discussion. It was an order. My irritation turned into something heavier. There was an unmistakable pattern in their language. They never actually said religious in the letters, but everything about the situation made it obvious that my decor was being treated differently because of what it represented. They had never seemed this concerned about monograms and sports flags. The next week, I started noticing the board members more often. One in particular, the kind of person who always had a clipboard and a permanent air of authority, began walking past my house slower than before. He would pause, glance at my door, and write something down. One evening, I watched from inside as he took another photo. It felt invasive, like my front porch had become a crime scene. Neighbors started acting different. People who used to stop and chat now waved from a distance and kept moving. A couple of them looked like they wanted to say something but thought better of it. The atmosphere shifted, and it was obvious why. The HOA had made me an example. A few days later, I received a second notice. This one included an itemized list of fines that would begin accruing if the violation remained. The amounts weren't life-ruining, but they were enough to sting, enough to make a point, enough to push a lot of people into quiet submission. I stood in my doorway, letter in hand, staring at the symbol I'd hung there. For the first time, I considered taking it down, not because I agreed, but because it would make my life easier, less stressful, quieter. But that thought felt wrong in a way that went deeper than inconvenience. This wasn't a plastic flamingo in the yard or a neon sign in a window. It was a small expression of who I was, anchored to the one place in the world I was supposed to control, my own home. If the HOA could tell me that even that small expression wasn't allowed, what else could they decide? Instead of taking it down, I started documenting everything. I took photos of my decor from multiple angles. I photographed other houses and their decorations, wreaths, flags, garden figures, yard art. I printed every email and letter, highlighting the phrases they used to justify their actions. I wrote down dates and times whenever I saw a board member stop in front of my house. The more I documented, the more obvious the pattern became. My little piece of religious decor was being singled out under the vague umbrella of uniformity, while the rest of the community's individuality was quietly tolerated. Then the HOA escalated again. A new memo went out to all residents. It explained that the board had reviewed the increasing number of exterior displays and had decided to clarify and tighten the rules. Moving forward, any permanent decor visible from the street would be considered non-compliant unless specifically approved. Temporary seasonal decorations would be permitted within reasonable time frames around culturally recognized holidays. It sounded neutral at first glance, but buried in the language was the real target. Anything that didn't fit into a neat, generic, non-religious, non-personal mold. The timing wasn't a coincidence. There hadn't been a wave of complaints, no neighborhood crisis over door hangings. This was a reaction to me. They were rewriting the rules mid-game, then applying them backward. It didn't stop with letters and memos. I received notice that I was scheduled for a compliance hearing with the board. A date, a time, and a warning. If I failed to attend or refused to comply, the board would be authorized to pursue all remedies allowed under the governing documents, including escalating fines and potential legal action. The idea that a group of my neighbors, who happened to hold board positions, could sit in a room and decide whether a small religious symbol on my own home was allowed or not made my blood boil. But beneath the anger, there was also something else. Fear. Fear of losing money. Fear of getting dragged into an expensive legal fight. Fear that they had more power than I did, simply because they had a board title and I was just a homeowner. That fear is what HOAs like this count on. One night, after tossing and turning, I opened my laptop and started digging deeper, not into the HOA documents, but into actual law. I searched for information on how far HOAs could go. I looked up stories of people in similar situations. I read article after article, case after case, and there it was, federal housing protections. I found references to the Fair Housing Act and how it doesn't just cover buying and renting, it also covers rules and practices that could discriminate based on religion. I read about cases where residents had been told to remove religious symbols from doorways or common areas, and how those rules had been challenged and overturned. I learned that uniformity and aesthetic standards can't be used as a smokescreen for discrimination. The more I read, the more the situation with my HOA stopped feeling like a petty local dispute and started looking like something much bigger. This wasn't just about decor, it was about rights. Armed with that information, I felt something shift. The imbalance started to feel less absolute. They had their CC&Rs. I had federal law. I prepared for the hearing. Instead of going in as a nervous homeowner begging for leniency, I went in as someone who had done their homework. I organized my documentation, the letters, the inconsistencies in enforcement, the timing of their new clarified rules, the photos of other decorations around the neighborhood, and printouts of legal guidance on religious expression in housing. In the days leading up to the hearing, the tension in the neighborhood became almost tangible. People avoided eye contact when they saw me heading to my car. A few, very quietly, slipped in quick words of support when nobody was watching. They knew what was happening was off. They just didn't want to be next. On the morning of the hearing, I stood in my kitchen, looking at the symbol by my door one more time. The HOA wanted it gone. They had threatened my wallet, my peace, and eventually, potentially, my home over it. But they had made one crucial mistake. They assumed I didn't know my rights. What they didn't realize yet was that this hearing they had arranged, this little pseudo-courtroom where they thought they held all the power, was about to become the stage for something they weren't prepared for at all, because by the time I walked into that room, I wasn't just a homeowner with a violation. I was someone ready to bring federal housing law into a neighborhood that thought it could make up its own rules and hide behind the word uniformity. And the moment I laid the first piece of evidence on the table, everything in that room began to change. The hearing room was just a converted conference space off the HOA's management office, but they had done everything they could to make it feel official. Long table at the front, chairs lined up facing it, the HOA logo framed on the wall as if it meant something more than a few signatures and a bank account. I'd seen people walk in and out of that room before, always looking smaller coming out than they did going in. This time, I was the one walking in. The board members were already there, sitting in a row, the usual faces, the president with that practiced air of composure, the clipboard enforcer who'd been stalking my sidewalk, a couple of quieter members who always seemed to vote with the majority. Off to the side sat the property manager, flipping through a folder stuffed with documents, ready to assist with whatever they needed. In front of them was a single chair. My name was typed neatly at the top of an agenda. Under it was my house number and the word violation, followed by a brief summary that reduced everything, the letters, the threats, the religious meaning, the stress, to one line about non-compliant exterior decor. They opened the meeting the way they always did, with formalities and procedure. Then they got to me. They listed the dates of the notices. They read their own rule interpretations out loud, as if hearing the words in the air made them more legitimate. They spoke about my decor as if it were some kind of hazard instead of a piece of faith mounted by a front door. They emphasized my failure to comply by the deadline and made a point of stating the fines that had already started accruing. They referenced community standards, uniformity, visual harmony. Each phrase dropped like a weight, designed to make me feel like I was the one breaking something fragile and precious. Sitting there, I could feel the imbalance they were used to. This was their arena, their schedule, their process. They were confident, almost relaxed, because they'd done this before. Someone gets called in, is reminded who's in charge, apologizes, agrees to remove whatever it is, and leaves grateful the punishment wasn't worse. They expected that version of me. Instead, I placed my folder on the table in front of me and opened it. I started not with law, but with their own neighborhood. I laid out photos, dozens of them, driveways and porches from around the community, wreaths, decorative initials, garden statues, flags, solar lights, front door hangings. I had been careful. Every photo was time-stamped, every address documented. I had neighbors' houses with decor far more noticeable than mine. I explained calmly that these items were all visible from the street, that they had been present for months, even years, without a single notice, that there were no records of hearings scheduled for those homeowners. I watched their faces as they processed that. The board president's expression tightened, The way someone does when they realize the conversation is no longer going exactly where they planned. The clipboard enforcer glanced at the photos, then back at me, like he wanted to contest them, but couldn't find the angle yet. The quieter members studied the images more closely, seeing, for maybe the first time, the discrepancy laid out in front of them. Then I moved to the next piece. I placed a copy of the original violation notice next to the community-wide memo that had been sent out later, clarifying the exterior decor rules. I pointed out the dates. First, they cited me under vague language that had never been enforced this strictly. Only after I pushed back did they suddenly decide the rules needed to be tightened and redefined for everyone. I described the sequence plainly. I installed a small piece of religious decor. I received a violation. I challenged it. Shortly afterward, the board changed the rules and began trying to apply the new, harsher standard retroactively, selectively, to me. The property managers shifted in their chair, flipping through the folder in front of them, probably hoping to find something in writing that would save the narrative. One of the board members avoided eye contact altogether, staring at the table instead. Up until that point, the tension had been high, but it was still just a dispute between a homeowner and an HOA. Annoying, stressful, unfair, yes, but still contained inside the walls of this room. Then I took out the next set of papers, and everything changed. These weren't neighborhood photos or HOA documents. They were printouts from federal and state housing resources, guidance from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, case summaries where associations and landlords had been forced to back down, and sometimes pay, after targeting religious displays under the guise of uniformity or aesthetic standards. I laid them out one by one. I explained what I'd learned about the Fair Housing Act. How it doesn't just apply to buying and renting, but also to rules and practices that could limit or chill the expression of someone's religion in housing. How policies that seem neutral on paper can become discriminatory when enforced selectively, especially when religious symbols are treated more harshly than non-religious ones. I pointed out how their language around uniformity and visual harmony perfectly matched the kind of justifications that had been rejected in previous cases. How the pattern of enforcement in our neighborhood, documented right there in those photos, showed that this wasn't truly about decor. It was about what my decor represented. The room felt different now. The board president's posture had changed. The confidence had slipped a few degrees. The clipboard enforcer was no longer scanning the room like a guard dog. He was suddenly very interested in the printed law in front of him. One of the quieter board members looked unsettled. Not angry, not defiant, uneasy, like someone realizing for the first time that they might be sitting on the wrong side of something serious. Then I dropped the part they were not prepared for. I told them, calmly, that I had already spoken to a fair housing organization, that I had already documented every letter, every notice, every photo, that I had already submitted a formal complaint to the appropriate agency outlining how this enforcement targeted a religious symbol under a vague uniformity rule that they had not applied evenly to anyone else. I explained that this hearing was not my last chance to comply. It was their first notice that this situation now existed outside of their private little world of CC&Rs and architectural guidelines. The property manager stopped fidgeting. They went still, then leaned closer to the papers, scanning the names of agencies and the words religious discrimination and Fair Housing Act, like they were reading a language they'd hoped never to encounter in their files. The board members began exchanging glances now, not just with me, but with each other. Silent questions moved across their faces. How serious is this? How exposed are we? Who approved this strategy in the first place? For the first time since I'd moved into the community, the power dynamic in that room flipped. They had brought me there to judge me, to pressure me into compliance, to make an example out of me in front of their own sense of authority. Instead, they found themselves staring at evidence that they were the ones crossing a line, one that wasn't just a neighborhood preference, but a federal boundary. I pointed out something else they had probably never considered, that once a complaint like this is filed, It doesn't just vanish if the board decides to quietly back down. There are records. There are investigations. There are potential consequences that go beyond one homeowner and one piece of decor. Mandatory policy changes, training, legal costs, maybe even penalties. The board president tried to recover the tone of control, shifting into more careful phrases about needing to review the information, about wanting to ensure that their policies were consistent with applicable law. But the edge was gone. The room could feel it. The board wasn't leading the conversation anymore. They were reacting to it. I sat there and let the silence do the work. They were no longer looking at a minor violation. They were looking at a paper trail that tied their decisions to potential religious discrimination. A symbol by a door had turned into a spotlight on how they wielded power over the people who lived under their rules. They wrapped the hearing up with none of the usual finality. No clear, confident declaration of penalties. No firm directive to remove the decor. Instead, there were vague statements about taking the matter under advisement, about consulting with legal counsel, about needing time to consider the new information. When I stood up to leave, I didn't feel triumphant in the loud, celebratory way people imagine. I felt something quieter, but deeper. For the first time since that notice had been taped to my door, I walked out of that building feeling like I wasn't the one on the defensive anymore. The weight that had been pressing down on me had shifted, and it was now pressing down on the people who had shoved it there in the first place. As I stepped back into the sunlight, past the manicured lawn and the carefully placed shrubs that framed the HOA office, I knew the battle inside that room was over. But the real consequences of what had just happened, those were only beginning to unfold. The first consequence was silence. Not the quiet, peaceful kind I'd hoped for when I bought into the neighborhood, but the heavy, loaded silence that follows a storm you know isn't finished yet. Days went by after the hearing with no word from the board, no new notices, no emails, no fines added to my account. Just nothing. On the surface, life in the community went on like normal. Kids still played in the cul-de-sac. Sprinklers still clicked on at dawn. Dogs still dragged their owners down the sidewalks. But there was a difference now in the way people looked at my house. Some neighbors glanced at my front door as they walked by, eyes lingering on that small symbol I'd refused to take down. It was still there, unchanged, quietly defying every letter and memo they had sent. A few people gave me small, almost imperceptible nods as they passed. Others looked away quickly, as if even acknowledging me might put a target on their backs too. Inside, the waiting worked on my nerves. Every time I heard the mailbox clank shut, my stomach tightened. Every email notification from the community portal made my pulse jump. Part of me expected them to come back even harder, to try some new angle, some new interpretation of a rule, some new tactic to make my life miserable. But the letters that started coming weren't from the HOA. They were from the outside. One afternoon, I opened an envelope with the letterhead of the fair housing agency I had contacted. It wasn't dramatic. It was formal, almost bland, but the words hit like a shockwave anyway. The letter confirmed that my complaint had been accepted and that an investigation had been opened. The agency would be requesting documents, correspondence, and policies from the HOA. They would be assessing whether the association's actions and their enforcement of uniformity might have violated federal and state housing protections related to religious freedom. It was right there in black and white. This wasn't just my personal belief anymore that something was wrong. It was now an official question in an official process. Did this HOA, with its obsession over visual harmony, cross the line into religious discrimination? Not long after that, the HOA finally broke their silence. They didn't ring my doorbell. They didn't send someone to talk in person. They did what organizations like this always do when things get serious. They hid behind paper and procedure. A formal letter arrived citing the ongoing investigation. It stated that, pending legal review, all fines associated with my violation were temporarily suspended. Enforcement actions regarding my front door decor were placed on hold. The tone was suddenly cautious. The language was no longer commanding. It was careful. They hadn't admitted anything, but they had backed off. The symbol stayed by my door. Day after day, week after week. No more threats, no more daily fines, no more talk of liens. That alone felt like a small victory, but it was only the beginning. Behind the scenes, the agency started doing what they do best, asking questions the HOA never expected to have to answer. They requested copies of the community's governing documents. They asked for records of all violation notices issued over a certain period. They wanted to see who had been cited for decor, who hadn't, what rules were used, and when the language about exterior displays had been clarified. In other words, they were doing what I had done with my camera and folder, but with subpoena power and legal authority. Word of the investigation leaked out, like it always does in communities where gossip travels faster than official email. I started noticing who avoided me more aggressively and who didn't. Some board members walked past me without so much as a glance. One of them, who had barely acknowledged my existence before all this, suddenly seemed very interested in being somewhere else entirely whenever I appeared. At the same time, neighbors I barely knew began finding small excuses to talk to me, bringing up unrelated topics, then gently circling toward the real one. Quietly, they admitted they had felt the board had gone too far. Some of them had their own stories. Garden decor rejected for ridiculous reasons, letters over trivial issues, a constant feeling of being watched and judged on their own property. They hadn't fought back because they assumed there was nothing they could do. Seeing someone push back and seeing the HOA actually flinch changed something. Months into the process, the Fair Housing Agency sent another letter. This one was different. They had found cause for concern in how the HOA had enforced its Décor and Uniformity standards. There was enough substance to the complaint that they were moving toward a formal resolution process, not just quietly closing the file. That phrase, cause for concern, carried weight. The HOA knew it too, because what came next was their attempt to control the damage. First came the special notice to all residents. It landed in everyone's inbox and mailboxes at the same time. The board explained that, after reviewing their policies and consulting with legal counsel, they had decided to revise their guidelines on exterior decor. It was carefully worded, full of corporate-style phrasing about inclusivity and respect. The new policy was clear in a way the old ones had never been. Small, non-damaging religious symbols and decor at entries and on front doors were now explicitly permitted, as long as they met reasonable size and placement guidelines. The HOA no longer reserved vague discretion to reject them for aesthetic reasons. The updated language referred specifically to federal and state housing protections and admitted in a roundabout way that the community's rules needed to reflect those laws. They never mentioned my name. They never mentioned the complaint. They never mentioned that the only reason they had suddenly discovered the importance of inclusivity was because they had been forced to look in the mirror by a federal-level legal framework. But everyone who was paying attention knew. The second consequence came directly to me. In a separate letter, the board informed me that all previous fines related to the decor had been permanently rescinded. The violation on my account had been removed. According to their records, there was no longer any outstanding issue. They stopped just short of apologizing outright, hiding instead behind passive phrases about misunderstandings and policy clarifications. The Fair Housing Agency didn't see it as a simple misunderstanding. As part of the resolution, the HOA agreed to more than just changing the rules and erasing my fines. They agreed to formal fair housing training for all board members and managers. They agreed to keep records of future enforcement actions in a way that made selective targeting harder to hide. There was even a modest financial settlement for the stress, time, and impact of their actions, now documented as more than just petty annoyance. Reading the terms of that agreement, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel up until then: vindication. They hadn't just backed off because I was loud or stubborn. They had backed off because what they did was wrong at a level that mattered beyond one neighborhood. The same symbol still sat next to my door, untouched, undisturbed. Now, though, it carried a different kind of weight. It was no longer just a quiet expression of my faith. It was proof that I hadn't been crazy or overreacting. Proof that uniformity had been used as a weapon, and that weapon had been taken out of their hands. The long-term impact reached further than my own front porch. Over the next year, the tone of the HOA started to change. Not overnight, and not completely. People don't surrender power that easily, but noticeably. The newsletter's once constant drumbeat about uniformity softened. New reminders started mentioning respecting individual rights alongside community standards. It sounded like someone had finally realized that the neighborhood existed in a real legal world, not just inside a binder of CC&Rs. Board meetings, which most people had ignored for years, suddenly had more attendees. Homeowners who had spent a long time grumbling privately began to show up, asking questions, listening, seeing who actually sat at that table making decisions. A couple of the more rigid board members decided not to run for re-election. They gave neat, polite reasons about personal time and moving on, but it wasn't hard to connect the timing. New people ran for open seats, regular residents, people who'd had enough of the old culture of control. They campaigned on things like transparency, fairness, and remembering that the board served the community, not the other way around. Some of them won. The clipboard enforcer who once walked the neighborhood like a self-appointed sheriff became just another homeowner again. No more clipboards, no more suspicious slow walks past my house, no more standing at the edge of other people's property, looking for violations like he was hunting trophies. The cultural shift was subtle, but real. I noticed it one day when I was walking the dog and passed a house with a clearly visible religious decoration very different from my own. It was bright, unmistakable, and front and center on their porch. A year earlier, that would have been an instant target. Now it was just there. Nobody was measuring it, photographing it, or threatening it. The neighbor caught me looking at it and for a second seemed braced for judgment. Instead, I just nodded and kept moving. Their shoulders eased, and I realized how deep the fear of scrutiny had run for a lot of people here. As for me, my own relationship with the neighborhood was complicated, but changed. I no longer saw the HOA as an untouchable authority. I saw it as what it really was, a group of people, capable of overstepping, capable of being corrected, and now a little more careful because someone had finally pushed back hard enough to leave a mark. I also understood my home differently. At the beginning, I had thought of it mostly in terms of financial investment and physical space. A mortgage payment, a lawn to mow, walls to paint. After all this, it became something else. A place where my identity and beliefs were allowed to exist without needing permission from a committee obsessed with everything looking the same. The irony is that, in their attempt to erase difference, the HOA ended up highlighting it in the strongest possible way. They taught the whole community a lesson they probably never intended to teach, that when rules are used to flatten people instead of protect them, those rules can and will be challenged. And when those challenges are grounded in actual rights, not just opinions, the people holding the rulebook don't always come out on top. Looking back, I think about the moment it could have gone another way. I could have quietly taken the symbol down and told myself it wasn't worth the trouble. I could have paid the fines, resented it in silence, and tried to keep the peace, while swallowing the knowledge that my own home wasn't fully mine. That's what a lot of people do in these communities. Not because they're weak, but because they're tired. But that's exactly what petty power counts on. That you'll decide your peace of mind is worth more than your principles, and slowly accept less than you're entitled to. In the end, this wasn't just a story about decor or religion or a single board overstepping. It was about something bigger hiding underneath all those buzzwords like uniformity and visual harmony. It was about control and what happens when someone finally says no. So if you live under an HOA or in a building with a landlord or association that throws around words like standards and consistency every time you try to make your space your own, you have to ask yourself, are they really protecting the community? Or are they just counting on you not knowing where their power actually ends? Because once you learn where that line really is, you might be a lot less afraid to push back when they try to step over it.